Hello and welcome to this installment of the Chinese Business History webinar at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. My name is Ghassan Moazin, and I'm one of the conveners of this webinar series. So today we're very happy and honored to welcome to the webinar Professor Judd Kinzley from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I think Judd is known to many of you. He works on modern Chinese history. He has published quite widely on things like natural resources and borderlands. His first book, Natural Resources and the New Frontier, Constructing Modern Chinese Borderlands, came out with the University of Chicago Press in 2018. And he's now working on a new book project, which is tentatively titled China and the War of Things, World War II and the Three Objects that Shaped the Modern World. And I think that's also what he's going to talk to us about, or some of it. Part of this new project is also what he's going to talk to us about today. His talk today is entitled Chinese Businessmen and the Economic Roots of the Cold War Order, 1938 to 1955. Before I hand things over to Professor Kinzley, just a few words about how things will work in the webinar today. So Professor Kinzley is going to talk for roughly 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have any questions, either during the talk or after we start the Q&A, please at any time feel free to submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out during the Q&A period, and Professor Kinzley can then get back to you and reply to you. But I don't want to take up any more time. So Judd, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Ghassan, and thanks very much to HKU. I'm really excited to have the opportunity. We don't do too many webinars now that the pandemic is finished. So it's nice to be able to speak to people in different time zones and different places. So it's a real pleasure. And it's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk about this project, because as I was telling Ghassan before we started things, that this project has become much more business history centered. And as I delve more into it, I realize there's more that I don't know. And so this is a nice opportunity, I think, for me to be able to engage with real experts in the field. And so it's an exciting thing for me. So thanks very much for having me. As Ghassan said at the beginning, this is part of a larger book project. The book project is focused on several resources, several commodities or objects, as he said in the title the title he read out at the beginning. Today, I'll focus primarily on one object, and in particular on one man. And the man I'll focus on today is a man named Casey Lee, known as Casey Lee in English, or Li Guoqin in Chinese. He's going to sort of sit at the center of this element of the project and sit at the center of the talk today. So essentially, to start, what I'd like to point to is the fact that in the early 1920s, Casey Lee was the president of a relatively small-time export company based in New York City. So the firm that Casey Lee had founded and was affiliated with was called the Huachong firm in English. It's the official English name. And Huachong specialized in the sale of American machinery to Chinese factories. But even more, the company served as the agent, and Lee himself served as an agent for American firms seeking out Chinese products. So the firm specialized in the import of minerals, produced largely in China, particularly antimony ore, but also a whole host of other products, including sesame seeds, tung oil, and other Chinese export products. I think, it's depending on what kind of definition you want to use, we can think about Lee as a comprador, which is why I've used the title here. And I don't mean it in a pejorative way, as it has often been kind of used in previous decades. But he's largely a comprador for his role in connecting local products to markets in Europe and North America. So by the late 1930s, however, as the U.S. begins seeking a whole host of strategic products, including things like antimony ore, but also materials like tungsten, the U.S. government turns to Li Guoqin, Casey Lee here, to help move ore from rugged regions in China's interior to factories in the United States. This is all beginning in the 1930s. After the war, Li is known widely on both sides of the Pacific as the so-called Tungsten King. And this is the title that he retains until his death in 1961. You have an image of Li. I'll say that some of these images came from family archives of the Li family. I think some are going to try to join us tonight, which is wonderful. I'm happy to have the opportunity to share some of these images with them and with you all. But Li is a tungsten king, but he's also just one king in a whole stable of Chinese kings who used the war and American demand for Chinese raw materials, which they were willing to pay for with US dollars, to elevate themselves into a new Chinese business class. There's a broad literature on the war in the United States that points to the war as a critical inflection point. The war sort of undermines the leftist ideals of the New Deal in the US government, empowers private business in ways that would resonate in the post-war period, and ultimately serving as the foundation for the neoliberal system we know today. My larger argument is that this sort of perception of the war as this inflection point is one that we can apply much more broadly and apply beyond China itself. So I'll argue that this is also true for American allies like China. The war itself, sort of American interest and desire and demand for strategic materials, helps elevate a new business class, allowing men like Li ultimately to build sort of independent economic fiefdoms. So like in the United States, the war empowers a new business overclass. And these men, in many cases, use their connections to the US or their control of the production of products demanded in the US to elevate themselves. And they established through the war deep connections to political figures in China, as well as to the United States. And so these men emerge as key trans-Pacific nodes during the wartime period, but particularly after the war, facilitating the exchange of Chinese raw materials for US dollars. And so today, I'll focus on Li's path to the tungsten throne during the war and in its aftermath, and showing how he used his expertise in the mining industry and his connections to US policymakers to elevate himself into the role of king. And Li's path reveals the origins of a larger strategy that was institutionalized during the war, undertaken by the United States to support allies financially and to acquire raw materials by relying on businessmen overseas to channel raw materials to the US. So this strategy served as the blueprint in many ways for forging the economic ties that held together the web of American alliances during the Cold War. This is occurring in Asia and other places in the global South. At the same time it does that, it also empowers a new business class with deep ties to the United States, and in some cases, after the war, to authoritarian regimes that they were allied to. All right. So to give a bit of background here on Li Guoqin's life, but also sort of the role of tungsten in the larger war effort, I want to step back a little and think about Chinese minerals. To understand Chinese mining in the 20th century, we do need to start with Western imperialism. On the left is an image from Ferdinand von Richthofen's book, China, published in the 1870s, and it's based on his own kind of surveys of China's interior, which he identifies as being particularly resource rich. But by the late 19th century, based on studies like von Richthofen's, the Western powers become very interested in China's the potential of China's resource wealth. This prompted a growing number of geological expeditions and new efforts to seize control of resource-rich areas and to found new companies in China that can acquire the materials that they would then be able to sell on global markets. But the interest, the Western interest in Chinese mines and Chinese minerals also prompted a new domestic drive among China's elites, a new drive to tap its own minerals. But Qing financial weakness in many ways meant that these efforts were not state-driven, but rather were driven by a new generation of Chinese businessmen in the early 20th century. And out of this emerged then a small handful of Chinese private companies that invested in mining operations in out-of-the-way ore fields in central China and helped facilitate the shipment of primarily raw ores to treaty ports where they were processed, and perhaps purchased by foreign export firms. And on the right, you have an image of Liang Huangkui, who was the founder of the Huachang Company, to be distinguished from Li Guoqin's Huachang Company. And I'll return to talking about Liang in a second. But what I want to also point to is the fact that these firms founded in China, often by wealthy former Qing officials, in the case of Liang Huangkui, also operated and relied on a new generation of Chinese geologists and mining engineers. And this is something that other scholars have worked on. Many of these men were trained overseas and had developed and began to develop deep and powerful contacts to the West. And this is where Li Guoqin, as he was born in China, comes into our story. So Li himself was born in rural Hunan province to a relatively poor family, but he managed to catch the eye of a former Qing official, in this case, Liang Huanghui, who I've already introduced. And Liang had become a powerful and prominent owner of the Huachang Mining Company, based in Changsha in Hunan province. And Hunan province, should be noted, had and indeed has one of the world's largest deposits of antimony ore. And antimony itself was an ore that was used to harden lead, mostly for bullets. As a result, in the run-up to World War I and during World War I, the price for antimony exploded, and Huachang cornered the market on the sale of antimony to Western import firms. Liang pays for Li's education in China, and later sends him to the Royal School of Mines in the United Kingdom, where he studied metallurgy. And after graduating in 1915, Li was sent by the Huachang Company to market Huachang's antimony ore directly to Western buyers in the United States. So no longer sort of serving as this role of connecting Western firms to raw material producers, but rather directly to American buyers themselves. And they established a new Huachang branch company in New York City. And Casey Li is one of the first staff members non-family staff members in that branch office in New York. And he's sent there in 1915. And the firm is really the first. The firm is notable for any number of reasons, and I think it's worth, deserves more history, I think, than it's gotten. But it's one of the first Chinese firms to sell its ore directly to American consumers. And it's quite successful, as it's able to build on its connections to central and southern China to acquire large stocks of ore from rugged, out-of-the-way mining regions worked by small groups of miners. They then took on this ore, which they purchased, or in many cases they owned mining operations, and marketed them directly to U.S. buyers. And the firm served as a key channel for the United States to acquire desperately needed antimony ore. And that is until the firm closes in the early 1920s, when the global price of antimony collapsed in the wake of the peace following World War I. But for Li himself, he stays on in the United States, heading a firm that's called the Huachang Trading Company. So again, you can distinguish the two firms, but they're clearly linked in some capacity. The Huachang Trading Company, as I started off, specialized in the sale of foreign machinery factories, the sale of foreign machinery to factories in China, but also, and probably more importantly, the import of Chinese products for American firms, including materials and minerals like antimony. For American firms, the Chinese mining industry was opaque. Early 1920s and even the 1930s, China was racked by political unrest and the struggle between various warlord factions. But Li, building on his connections through the original Huachang Company and his personal connections into ore-producing areas in central and south China, was successful in acquiring ores at relatively low prices and channeling them to the United States, where they were sold directly to manufacturers. It was a complex process of acquiring the ores, and Li develops a reputation for his success in meeting the needs of American firms. And here you get a sense from the flagship journal of the industry, relaying Li's sort of qualities as far as the American manufacturers are concerned. So he's able to sort of build a reputation through his abilities to connect producers with American firms, and this ultimately allows him and connects him up with important figures in the U.S. industry and also increasingly in the U.S. government. All right, so I want to turn away from Li to tungsten itself. Sorry, my slides are a little mixed up here. So tungsten has been viewed, or was viewed, as a critical industrial mineral since the early 20th century. The ore was hard, had a high melt point, and as an alloy could cut steel better than any other material. And demand, like with antimony, the demand for tungsten ore spiked in World War I. as the warring powers sought the ore to produce the machinery, the machine tools that they needed to manufacture shells and other military equipment. And ultimately, a wide kind of global search for tungsten during the run-up to World War I and during World War I eventually ended in China, which it turned out had massive resources of the ore. By the 1920s, China was producing around 3/4 of the world's total quantity of tungsten. And by the 1930s, when tungsten prices spiked again, China was in a position to profit. And one important thing in thinking about this, the role of tungsten, is China really relied on the sale of minerals like tungsten and other products throughout the 1930s to finance modernization and industrialization campaigns and other things. But this reliance became even more important after 1937 and the Japanese invasion, when the sale of ore became a critical pillar in the nationalist government's wartime economy, allowing them to be able to purchase weapons, industrial products, and generate foreign currency more generally. China's dependence on the sale of these goods led to efforts to control them through new monopolies and the strengthening of government institutions. But the key link in connecting these resources to the markets that were demanding them remained relatively tenuous. And government officials, despite issuing new regulations, seeking to sort of secure more government control over the production of these resources, relied heavily on merchant investors to fund production. And they also relied on men like K.C. Lee to help move these goods from China to foreign markets. And so the origin story in many ways for K.C. Lee, Li Guoqin, and his connections to both the US government, the Chinese government, is in 1940, when a massive quantity of nearly 6,000 tons of tungsten ore was stranded on the docks of the port of Haiphong in French Indochina. It was about to be seized by Japan in the summer of 1940, and the Chinese government desperately calls on Li to facilitate the movement of these goods, this movement of these critical strategic minerals to the United States government. So again, wartime in many ways is viewed by scholars as an inflection point, a moment which transformed government business relations in the United States. It's a moment when the New Deal ideals of an empowered government keeping private greed in check is largely rolled back. The American entry into the war, and again, this is sort of the larger scholarship on a US business history connected to the Second World War. But the American entry into the war in December 1941 helps create a far more kind of permeable connection between government and business, sort of something that was much more separated in earlier policies under the New Deal, creating much more of a revolving door between corporate leaders and government officials in the United States. So the war, in many ways, the argument goes, helps lay the foundation for the resurgence of American business interests after the war. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, what's been largely unexplored is the fact that what's happening in the United States in the war is also happening in the context of China. It's happening overseas as a result of the same US policies driving kind of military mobilization. So powerful American institutions like the War Production Board or the Reconstruction Finance Corporation work closely with businessmen with overseas connection in order to acquire the goods that they needed in order to fuel the larger American war effort. And so this included things like tungsten ore, but also tin ore, hog bristles, tung oil, silk, goose feathers, among many, many others. So in 1939, desperate to build a stockpile of tungsten, the US government was awarded Lee a large contract to supply Chinese ores to the United States. This is largely based on his success in moving the ore from French Indochina, but also his connections to the US business industry earlier on. Later, after the American entry into the war, it turns again to Lee, and it draws heavily on Lee's expertise in reports and conversations about how to acquire tungsten ore, and his expertise in understanding how tungsten moves and potential bottlenecks in that larger tungsten system. And these reports and conversations are scattered and retained in archives in the United States and China. Even more, the US Metals Reserve Company signs a contract with Lee's Huachang Company in 1941 to establish a large tungsten ore processing plant in the United States in New York on Long Island. And this company was to draw in Chinese ores, but also increasingly new deposits from the United States and also even more Latin America. So Lee's role in the war effort was part of a larger effort in the United States, an effort to rely on well-connected businessmen with overseas contacts who would be able to facilitate the movement of critical materials. So government officials in the United States relied on the expertise of businessmen like Lee to acquire these materials. And they supported them with long-term, we can call sweetheart contracts, and to help them with international transport. And Lee emerges really as a critical consultant for both China and the United States during the war, offering his opinions on US public opinion and policy to Chinese leaders, writing a stream of letters and reports to various government figures in China about what's happening in the United States, and also similar letters to the United States to US officials about what's happening in China. And he also comes to serve in various formal capacities related to international policy, including by 1944, he's selected to sit on China's delegation to the Bretton Woods conference. He's involved with any number of these kinds of activities. And in the US, he's seen as an expert on China more generally and mining in particular. He writes reports on an industry that was largely opaque to US officials, to his network of contacts in the United States. And he develops contacts with high-ranking leaders through his China connection, and even meets President Roosevelt on at least one occasion to talk about procurement policy and the production of tungsten and other ores. But wartime demands for Chinese strategic materials leads to the emergence of a vast web of trans-Pacific connections. And these connections are largely worked by Chinese businessmen, not only Lee, but others who control the production or circulation of other Chinese goods that are in demand in the United States. So while Casey Lee Guoqin is crowned the tungsten king after the war, there's also a tung oil king and a hog bristle king, all of whom are kind of connected to this larger war effort. And these men all work closely with Chinese government officials and also with their American counterparts. And they took this role in many ways into the post-war period. And they're viewed in the post-war period as being essential cogs in an emerging global system. And this global system was to be rooted in the Wilsonian ideals of free trade and free enterprise, this new world order that's being crafted in the US State Department and other US agencies coming out of the war. The US government explicitly sought to cultivate these figures, men like Lee, who benefited in turn from US efforts to deregulate China's economy. And they've given generous contracts and new relationships with American markets. So there seem to be sort of critical elements in this larger and emerging post-war world order that would be much more deregulated, much more focused on private enterprise and free trade. But for all of their connections to the United States and their sort of role for the US government, the Chinese government also depended on them. The government used them to acquire desperately needed foreign currency. They became central figures and enjoyed deep contacts to the state and to government officials. They used this to expand their footprint and ultimately, as I mentioned, to become kings. In the end, these men drew on their connections to American markets and to Chinese officials to get wealthy and powerful. And in the end, they became a powerful economic class. And this is an excerpt from a letter that Casey Lee wrote back to his family, 1948, in which he sort of points to some of the inequalities that are emerging among the members of this class, this sort of elite class of businessmen with deep connections to the West who have access to foreign currency and contacts with the Chinese government. So in the end, they become a powerful economic class, and there seemed to be in many ways tangible evidence of Nationalist Party corruption and facilitated its collapse in some capacity in 1949, or at least kind of contributed to a larger environment that would facilitate its collapse. So to take it beyond the wartime period, for the US, the collapse of China prompted a fear, fear that the connection to vital resources like tungsten was in danger. a fear that the rise of communist parties potentially would jeopardize American access to desperately needed strategic materials that were needed for the emerging for emerging war industries coming out of the post-war period. Ultimately, this fear, particularly after 1949 in the early 1950s, prompts a doubling down of the model used in the wartime period. So the collapse of China and the drying up of access to essential minerals like tungsten points to the need to cultivate a wider network of connections to resource-rich allies. Some sense here from the ways in which the US government is talking about these concerns about the distribution of resources in areas spreading across the global south. And there's actually, the quote should not be in front of resources, just to be clear. So the fear then, or the desire, was to create a wider network of resource-rich allies in order to make sure they're not too dependent on a single country for a given product. So they're not dependent on China, for example, for tungsten. And this led to a new outreach efforts to various resource-rich, but often foreign currency poor nations, particularly in East Asia, but also Latin America and Africa. And Lee played a critical role in economic outreach for the United States during the Cold War. So building up that capital and really working with the connections that he makes during the war. He begins to serve a critical role for economic outreach to various places around the world. Even if China is closed off, he has other connections that he can draw upon. Here's an image here of Lee in Brazil, and he starts to play this much more broad sort of global role. So he works closely with American government actors to set up new purchasing agreements with countries like South Korea, Mexico, like in the newspaper article here, and like Brazil, cultivating contacts among the business communities and government officials within these resource-rich places. And he also continues his larger campaign of building processing facilities in the US for ore. So many of these ores that were being imported to the United States were then being processed in facilities that were run by Lee himself. So he plays a really critical role in this larger effort. And the post-war efforts relied on blueprints. I mean, the larger story I want to tell here is that the post-war efforts, these efforts in Brazil, various places across the global south, was built on blueprints and on a foundation that was developed in China during the wartime period. So these blueprints drawn up during the war in China for a state-managed system of economic connection that fostered a network of alliances with resource-producing countries, undergirded with a steady flow of American dollars and industrial goods purchased with shipments of strategic materials. That's part of this larger system that's being developed. And this is sort of the effort by the United States to reach out to these resource-rich places in the global south. But these relationships, like in the case of China, were made material by the businessmen, men like Lee in the case of China, who had local contacts to labor and to production networks. And these contacts then allowed them to be successful in producing the strategic materials that were in demand by the United States. In many ways, Lee, by the 1950s, serves as a US government agent. He's still a private businessman, but is much more engaged in sort of this larger effort throughout the global south, facilitating the expansion of this government-centered system through his own efforts to build networks of producers in Brazil, Mexico, and elsewhere. But this is part of a much larger strategy that's being undertaken by the US government. All right. So thinking about kind of wrapping things up a little bit, I want to think about the resonances of the story. What do we do with the story of Lee? This is something that I'm actively grappling with, this sort of larger question. What do we say about Casey Lee and his larger role in this system? I think on the one hand, what the story of Lee can tell us is a wider story about, and I think probably the most simplistic story that we can say is that Lee is part of a much wider story about the war. We tend to sort of think about leaving aside sort of the narratives of the war that are connected to the battlefield, but in terms of thinking about war mobilization, we tend to think about the story of war mobilization as being a story of American heroism in many cases, of American businessmen coming together, sacrificing profit for the sake of battling fascism. I'm not saying that's not a part of this larger narrative, but what I think is important and what Lee points to and the story of Huachong points to, is that this is a much larger transnational story, a larger and transnational story with deep roots, not just in Europe, but also in resource-rich countries across the global South. And these were ultimately bound into a larger war effort through American procurement policies. And I think that this is an important contribution and something that's worth really remembering when we're kind of thinking about the war and sort of thinking beyond sort of the confines of an American-centric perspective on the war. We can expand the number of actors and the number of agents who are involved in this larger war effort to include men like Casey Lee, but also miners, peddlers, truck drivers, all these individuals who are involved in not only securing these products, but making sure that they're delivered to the United States. Sorry, I missed this slide, but so it's expanding our perspective of the Second World War. But finally, what I want to end with is thinking something I'm still sort of grappling with here, is thinking about how this economic system that's developed in China in many cases. I mean, many of these sort of American operations start in Latin America, but are really made global through the outreach to China in the early years of the war. This economic system that's developed in China, sort of cobbled together with Chinese government officials working with Chinese businessmen, and led in many ways by American businessmen and American dollars and American officials. This larger system serves as a blueprint for a larger post-war Cold War system. And this system sought to create long-term agreements with resource-rich countries, in this case, like China. And these states became dependent on the sale of strategic materials and sweetheart contracts with allies. And these agreements, in many ways, then served as the economic glue that solidified American alliances in Asia and the global South. So a lot of our work on understanding US power in the Cold War period, particularly when it comes to East Asia, is thinking about American military power. But thinking about the role of economic power, I think, is also something that's worth pointing to, and thinking about the roots and the foundations of where the larger systems that are being established by the United States government, how they're being developed, and how they're developed in China and ultimately exported outward. And this larger system served, I think you can make the argument, served as the foundation that facilitated a dependency, an economic dependency, as these states ultimately reconfigured their economies to meet American demands. And so in many ways kind of create economic problems at the same time that they are generating profit and generating kind of foreign currency for these states. It also serves to empower corrupt authoritarian governments. So in places like Bolivia, South Korea, South Vietnam, Taiwan, regimes in these countries empowered groups of politically connected businessmen to keep resources flowing. This empowerment fueled socioeconomic inequalities that drove social movements that, in some cases, destabilized these American allies. And so I think China is one case. The other case, I seem to have missed a slide here, is in Bolivia. Bolivia became quite dependent and had reoriented its economy toward the production of tin for U.S. interests. And after the war, as the United States sought to kind of secure larger quantities at a lower price, this created real economic problems for the country. And this creates ultimately instabilities and popular movements among American allies in the Cold War period, which shaped the Cold War order. In many ways, trying to argue today, and it's something I'm happy to get a chance to get some feedback on, are a product of the China case. And the 20th century stories, in many ways, are a mirror of China's path from dependent state to rival after 1949. And I'll leave things there, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Judd, thank you so much for giving this great presentation and a really wonderful topic and case study, I think. So as I said, we now have some time for questions. So if anyone has questions, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I can read them out for Professor Kinzley, and he can then get back to you. Maybe I can start us off with a question that sort of came to my mind, and that takes us sort of back more to the beginning of KCD's story and your presentation. I mean, I was very surprised that already in 1915, Huachang kind of first sent him to study abroad, and then in 1915, if I remember correctly, sent him to the US to open up a branch. Because I mean, if I think of sort of resource extraction in the early Republican period, I suppose I'm still thinking about sort of more the imperial mode of extraction. That you have foreign companies that are in China and they are the conduit, and they kind of um, are the as you mentioned as well, are sort of the middleman between the foreign countries and China. But so I was wondering whether you could talk a bit more about how the setting up of Huaqiang's business in the US actually worked and how common that actually was. I mean, I think that then plays into because sort of you said that that was a rather new phenomenon that a Chinese company would set itself up in the US like that. But how does that then become quite common in the decades after that, or sort of how representative is KCD, I suppose, is the bigger question that I'm asking.
Sure. It's a great question. My sense is that it's quite unique, that the establishment of the New York firm is quite unique. And there's a bit of history of some of this through Chinese literature that talks about the efforts by the Huaqiang company ultimately to end a series of exclusive contracts that they had signed with European firms, paying a penalty effectively to these companies in order to be able to get some control over the circulation of these goods and to get out of these exclusive contracts and ultimately to market them themselves. But my understanding is, and I haven't seen anything that contradicts this, that the Huaqiang case is quite unique. And it's something I haven't seen other examples for, which is why I think it's worth probably more study. And what I think is less clear to me, and I'm hoping to get more clarity on this in the future, is exactly how that mechanism worked, and that's much more difficult to piece together. And for me, the challenge in some ways of doing business history and not sort of state histories like I've done in the past is finding sort of the sources that allow you to understand how some of these decisions and how some of these engagements among different business actors and businesses were happening. And it's not something I have much access to, the specifics of that larger mechanism. But my sense is that it is a unique it's a unique position for the Huaqiang company, and it's for that reason I think that's worth kind of thinking about more, despite the fact that the story of Huaqiang in many ways is a story of failure as the company collapses in the early 1920s.
Right, yeah, thank you. Again, I think this is a really interesting case.
Thanks.
All right, we have our first few questions. So the first question comes from Amy King, and she says, thanks for a fascinating talk. I'm interested in how you think about the power hierarchy between resource-rich countries like China, who are producing these strategic commodities, and the industrialized countries like the US who sought to acquire them. To what extent are actors like Li trying to help move China up the value chain so that it could genuinely profit from these resources, rather than remaining in the quote-unquote backward state of being at the low value add commodity exporting stage of development? There are parallels with China's contemporary experience with attempts to control its position in the global rare earth market.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and I'm ashamed to say I don't have a really strong answer to thinking about, but I think that the Huaqiang company in particular was engaged. They had a processing facility, which was also a bit unique for a Chinese-owned firm in the 19-teens to be processing antimony ore. And that to me feels like to be part of the larger model from before was to export raw ore to Western firms that then would process the ore either in treaty ports or overseas, largely in treaty ports, just to keep transport costs down. But there is effort, and I think Huaqiang, what sort of sets Huaqiang apart is its ability through government connections in many cases to import certain kinds of processing equipment, and that allows it to be successful in a way that other firms would not have been able to do, importing them into China, into Changsha, in a very large facility in Changsha. And interestingly, Casey Lee is not really involved in that that type of enterprise really until the early 1940s, until he gets a contract with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and with the Metals Reserve Company. He's not really involved in processing ores. He's largely just importing ores and then delivering them to American import firms. But I think that that's something you see circulating in the minds of many Chinese government officials is how to, rise up the value chain, as you say. And this is something you see. It's not just an ore story. I also do connected to this book project is hog bristles, and hog bristles is another thing that's actually quite it requires a significant amount of processing, and there's a desire quite early on for the Chinese government to make sure that it is or for Chinese firms to make sure that they are involved in the processing side, not only producing raw bristles for exactly the reasons that you pointed to. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, very interesting. One thing I can that sort of comes to mind for me is that one thing you need tungsten for is the filaments in light bulbs, and certainly in the Chinese government, sort of in the 30s, there is sort of from what I've read for my research is this fear that you become you have all this tungsten and you're really important in that, but why aren't we the ones who are actually processing it properly? So
Sure.
that's definitely like a very interesting question.
I mean, my guess is that the raw tungsten would have been produced in China, shipped to the West, and then shipped back in filament because of the difficult process.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yeah,
exactly. And that seems to that I think to many Chinese government officials is sort of something they will want to get around eventually.
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. The next question comes from John Fung, and he asks, just out of curiosity, are there any archival documents that indicate Li's affiliation with the KMT? Did Li use his connections or resources to lobby the US government for the Republic of China?
Yeah. I mean, Li has really deep connections to the Chinese government throughout the wartime period, but even before. I mean, there's a lot of sort of material on his personal correspondence with men like Chen Guangfu and other prominent figures within the Chinese government or Chinese government adjacent kinds of figures. And he serves in an official capacity for various Chinese institutions, including the China Trust. At one point, he serves on various boards that are connected to raw material, Chinese government raw material controls. So there's a lot of whether or not he's officially affiliated with the KMT or not. My guess is that he is, but I haven't seen sort of the KMT identity card or something like that would point to that affiliation. But just based on sort of the depth of his connections, it seems clear to me that he has deep connections to the Chinese to the Chinese government, to the KMT government in particular. And I think that he's referred to in some US government sources as an agent of the Chinese government. He has very close connections to Kong Xiangxi, H.H. Kong, and US government officials are aware of that. And I think that he is, in many of his reports, and he writes a significant number of reports, particularly to agencies like the War Production Board or the Foreign Economic Administration, that are advocating for policy positions that clearly benefit the Chinese government. I mean, you can argue that they also benefit the war effort, but I think this kind of question of lobbying is a complicated one. I would say that he is lobbying, but not in an official capacity. He's sort of an unofficial lobbyist for the Chinese government, although the US government sees him as lobbying or as an agent, as some have said.
All right, thanks. The next question comes from Xu Yuji, and the question is, hi, Professor Kinzley. Thank you for your amazing presentation. I have a quick question. How did Casey Lee's relationship with the US and his factory connection with the capitalist states, how were they utilized in the socialist state construction, and how were they evaluated by the CCP after 1949?
Yeah. I mean, his factory, the thing for Casey Lee is his factories were all in the United States. So he has deep connections to individuals who are involved in production, but as far as I can tell, has a limited sort of direct capital investments on the ground in China. That's my sense for his position. I think what's more interesting in some ways is what his reputation in China today in some ways, because he's not super well known, to be honest. There is a whole genre of works on red capitalists that others have written about, and I'm sure I don't need to talk too much about with this audience, but he's not really included and not really discussed in depth in some ways because he's seen to sort of be a traitor, right? He's not directly involved with or he's not involved in the construction of socialist China. He leaves, he renounces his Chinese citizenship, becomes a US citizen by 1943. And so ultimately his positionality is, he's viewed kind of questionably. But there are other cases of other kings who don't leave and who stay in China. And so who have a different sort of relationship with the process of constructing new China after 1949.
The next question comes from Eric Thompson, and he says, you've mentioned contact with the family to obtain photos and problems and questions of sources. Are there any family archives, and could you speak more generally about sources?
Sure. There is an informal family archive. I mean, it does involve people who are still around and might be listening on the call, so I don't want to get into too much detail, but there are family archives. And I think one of the reasons in some ways that Li's sort of larger legacy is not well known is I think that his papers are now relatively scattered. And so it's a bit more difficult. There's no sort of large set of materials through which historians can reconstruct his business empire and reconstruct his actions during the Second World War, and beyond. So there are materials that I've worked with through my connections to some family members of the Li family. But it's not clear if those are all of the materials, and they're quite scattered and they're divided up among different family members, and that makes things slightly complicated. And so what I've been trying to do beyond those materials is to work in archives primarily in Taiwan. There's a significant amount of material through the NRC, the Ziyuan Weiyuanhui collections that are available in Taiwan, in the Guoshiguan and other places, and also in the Academia Sinica. So it's sort of an effort to combine different source bases and to see how I can bring them into conversation with one another. But like I said, I mean, for me, what's been eye-opening about this process is the complexity of doing work on private actors as opposed to state actors. Where do you find those materials? What's not there in the historical record? It's a different challenge, I think, in dealing with some of the businessmen who I'm dealing with in this project that I didn't necessarily face with the previous one. So I've been excited to get some family photos, some scattered materials from the family, but I think that there's other material out there, but it's hard to know. It can be difficult to. There's no sort of central repository to finding it, which I think is a shame.
All right. The next question, or it's maybe a comment rather, comes from Wei Sugar. And she says, thank you for your wonderful talk on an interesting topic. I studied Huachang under Liang Huanyi and Yang Du in the 1910s to 1920s and found that the Hunan locals eventually broke up with Li Guoqin, even accusing him of the murder of a member of the Liang family in the United States. The case was not further investigated, but it suggested the tough relations between Li and the Liang family.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you want to.
There's an interesting story, I think, there that connects to the Huachang Company, and also and Li's role within that, because there's clearly some contentious relationship there. It's just difficult to reconstruct it. And I found that the same story. The second brother's son, who was in the United States, was found to be murdered. This was from an account of a family member. I haven't been able to verify that in any other source. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I haven't been able to find it. But there is some tensions there. And there's a feeling in some cases that Li had stolen the family, the Liang family's company, the Huachang Company or the Huachang Company, and he'd stolen that name, was profiting off of it in a way that was unfair to that Liang family. There is a certain amount of frustration that continues to exist, and like I said, there's a series of rumors that you can find about the family, it's just hard to substantiate them, and I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. I think my hunch, without having any evidence to back it up, is that this was that Lee was not involved in whatever it is happened with that family member. But again, it could change if there's other sources that emerge. But I haven't even been able to even really confirm that the murder happened. So Shugo, if you have material, and let's be in contact. I'd love to talk about it more.
Yeah, thanks. Do we have? Oh yeah, there's another question. And it comes from Carlson Zhao. He says, "Hi, Professor Kinzley. Thank you for your talk. I'm wondering to what extent Casey's enterprise can be viewed as a movement for Chinese modernization and self-strengthening. Thank you."
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's part of a. I don't know how I'd answer that. I mean, I think it's part of a larger narrative, I guess, that I think is related very much to Chinese business history, is my sense, and it's sort of this movement away from more of I guess it's kind of what the argument I'm trying to make here is that their movement away from this focus on comprador efforts to connect resources to American firms, and rather to sort of have to form firms that in and of themselves become much more involved in that process of adding value to certain kinds of products. I'm not sure that the Casey Lee case fits as nicely within that, given the fact that he doesn't really spend a significant amount of time or invest a significant amount of capital in any of these specific industries in China itself. But I do think it's a part of that larger story, and hopefully other scholars can sort of make that case in sort of a larger sense about Chinese industrialization or self-strengthening campaigns, if you want to call them that, in the early 20th century.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I mean, one question I wanted to ask, if it would be sort of whether you can tell us a bit more about the larger book project and how KCD fits into that. I mean, you mentioned that, and we know you've obviously published an article in the AHR on hog bristles. So, and I think that's also part of the book project. So I wonder, whether you can tell us a bit more about the larger book project and how KCD fits into that.
Sure. Yeah, so the book project is focused on several. I mean, as the title suggests, it focuses on several resources, and tungsten is one of those resources. But it's also focused on hog bristles and tung oil, and what I'm trying to really understand here is how the war itself and how American demand in particular shapes China internally, and how this sort of demand for these raw materials reconfigures the lives of individuals who are engaged with that the production of certain kinds of goods, and ultimately how it has a powerful impact in shaping sort of the socioeconomic dynamics of modern China. But it's a wartime story, and I'm trying to sort of think about what the resonances of the larger wartime story are, thinking about them in the Cold War period in particular. But most of the book itself is focused on thinking about the war, and thinking about, again, how this American demand reshuffles in many ways kind of Chinese politics, Chinese economic connections. And men like Lee play this really critical role. They're super important in serving as these trans-Pacific nodes in the delivery of goods between China and the United States. And this is a story, I think, that we're continuing to grapple with, sort of the ways that the trans-Pacific connections between the United States and China, and the individuals who are involved in that. And I think that to resurrect that in this particular moment, I think is meaningful. But again, this is a wartime story. I'm trying to focus on specific goods and specific industries that will allow me to sort of think about how American demand helps shape a new, emerging world order that comes out of the Second World War. So that's sort of the larger project.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right. It doesn't seem that we have any further questions. So what remains for me to do then Judd, is to thank you very much for. Oh, there is another question, of course, as I'm about to conclude. I think we still have time for that. So maybe a final question. So this question comes from Mim Fong Ho, and the question is: are there any written records about the 1916 sale of antimony from KCD to the US? Are rumors true that KCD urged the Huacheng office in China to sell antimony as the price of antimo Huacheng was falling, and that Huacheng refused to sell? If so, did this create a rift between the two families?
Right.
Li founded the Huacheng company in the US in 1916, and only after those repeated refusals. There seems to be a lot of interesting things going on between the two families, but yeah, I wonder whether you want to comment on that.
I haven't seen the evidence for that yet. I mean, what's at issue here is whether or not, again, whether Li was kind of profiting, had exploited the Liang family's goodwill. They sent him over there. He profits off of this antimony, or they don't get quite the profit that they were expecting, and as a result, that drives the company into the ground. My hunch is no, but I haven't seen the evidence yet. There's still some materials that I'm going through, and it's possible some of that material will be available, but I haven't fully gone through all of the material yet. But I think what this points to, and several of the questions point to, is that there is a bigger story here about Li and the Liang family that still hasn't been told, and I hope one day it will be told, but I'm not sure if the sources fully exist to be able to tell it in a way that will make everybody happy.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. All right, as I said, we're pretty much coming up against the end of time, and I know how late it's in the US now, so I don't want to hold you up any longer. In any case, what I wanted to say is thank you very much for taking the time to go as a talk and to talk about your very interesting research. I think we're all looking forward to learning more in the future, and certainly looking forward to the book. So everyone, please keep an eye out for that. Also, thank you to everyone who has tuned in for this talk. And yeah, again, Judd, thank you very much, and thanks also for answering all our questions so patiently. So
No,
thank you very much.
It was a great opportunity. I really appreciate everyone who showed up, and appreciate you for introducing and welcoming me. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone. See you
Thanks.
soon. Bye-bye.